Любой человек, примирившийся с идеей собственной смерти, способен превратиться в чрезвычайно опасного воина. Он всегда готов отдать свою жизнь на поле боя. Энергия, с которой прекрасно обученные самураи рвались в бой, стала нарицательной. А поскольку противник обладал такой же абсолютной преданностью, то поединок превращался во взаимное убийство. Поэтому в сражениях военачальник полагался только на численность воинов или на собственный талант стратега. Почитание сенсея было абсолютным, ведь именно он передавал тайные секреты мастерства ученикам. Самураи мастерски владели не только мечом, но и любым другим оружием. И прежде всего, они в совершенстве владели своим телом. Именно самураи разработали боевые искусства, ныне ставшие. Во всем облике самурая и его привычках соблюдался особый культ чистоты. Каждое утро, совершив омовение, самурай надевал чистую одежду и был физически готов к смерти вплоть до кончиков наманикюренных ногтей. Умереть неопрятным считалось позором, а смерть могла прийти к самураю в любой момент. Самурайский меч обладал огромной прочностью. Им можно было перерубить другой меч менее высокого качества или самурайские доспехи, или человека от плеча до пояса.
Dai is essentially about the initial coming together of two opponents. So the nukitsuke, the initial draw, is the most important part in Dai. Starting from Taito, the sword in the obi, each one steps forward with the hand coming to the tsuka, stepping across with the left foot and beginning the draw and threatening the opponent. As Uchitachi steps in, Shitachi steps back and receives the cut. Having applied pressure here, Uchitachi steps back into Kasumi no Kamai, Chudan Kasumi, and Shitachi into Jodan. The Kisaki is now on the line of his center line. As I step forward, I'm going to thrust right toward his neck, stepping across with the right foot, then a stutter step, left foot, right foot. Shitachi then steps offline and cuts to Uchitachi's neck. Uchitachi lowers the sword, steps back, and matches Shitachi's Chudan no Kamai. Both lower the sword and step back at the same time. Dai. Hey. Yeah. Dai. Hey. Yeah. Ukenagashi is practiced from an initial draw in the Batoho section. The first attack by Uchitachi is actually a Yokuuchi Monji. So if you follow along, you'll notice you're actually going to receive the technique in a vertical block that covers from the hip to the head on this one if you're taking the Shitachi part. So we start from Taito, swords in the obi, stepping forward with the right foot, left hand comes up, then stepping with the left foot crossing, beginning to threaten with the draw, and remembering that the Skagashire is online. Uchitachi steps forward and cuts Yokuuchi Monji and is blocked vertically by Shitachi's sword, running from his hip to above his head. The pressure on the sword makes me step back and retreat to a hasso position, and that is mirrored then by Shitachi. Notice that the sword is at an angle of a 45, so that the Tsukagashi is pointing toward the opponent's toe. As Uchitachi steps in, he cuts directly down the center on a little yoko, a little bit of a kesa cut, and that's matched as Shitachi steps back. Notice Shitachi's kisaki is now online. This prevents Uchitachi from moving in any further. And the pressure from the hip makes Uchitachi step back, again, cutting, this time left to right. On this side of the sword, my kote, my wrist, is much closer to Shitachi's than it was on the other side, which makes me move backward because this is now unprotected. So I have to move this out of the way into a jodan position. At this point, Shitachi moves his sword offline to invite the attack. And this is where, when Uchitachi steps in, the ukenagashi that you had learned occurs. Stepping in, cutting, he receives, releases, and cuts to my head. I step back, continuing to threaten my center. I raise the sword and match on the omote side of the sword. We lower the swords and come to a neutral position. Ukenagashi. Ukenagashi. In order to perform proper sue monogiri or tameshigiri, which is test cutting, we need to understand how to roll a mat, which is a tatami mat, which we call tatami omote, or it's a mat cover. It's made of rice straw, and as it's rolled and then soaked, we soak it for about 12 hours, and it gains the consistency of a normal human target. So what I'm going to teach you right now is how to roll the mat so that it stays tight, it remains together, and a lot of technical pieces don't go flying all over after you've performed your cut. So we take the mat and lay it out in front of us, and then we fold it toward the center. This gives you less mat to have to roll in the process, and bring it about halfway or a little bit past, so you're folding up to about 2/3 of the mat. Then you bring the other side and just fold it in approximately 1 foot. So we've got 2 folds in the mat at this point. Then spin the mat away from you so that the shorter folded part is away from you. So that now we're holding one end of the mat, the longer folded edge, toward myself. Now I want to keep the mat very firm and very tight as I roll it. So what I do is I take my left foot and place it on the mat in this position. Then from behind, as my foot is centered, I start to roll the mat, keeping tension as I pull. And I start to wrap and pull. This keeps firm tension on the mat so that when I cut, it doesn't go flying, the pieces don't go flying all over, as well as the fact that when I begin to soak the mat, it's obviously going to expand slightly. So I want a very tight fit in the beginning. Continuing to roll all the way up until eventually I meet the smaller folded piece. At that point, I release my foot and start to roll with just my hands. Continuing to roll, tucking the last folded piece in, and rolling toward the final edge. Once I've gotten to the edge, I want to reach around and squeeze that edge tight against the full maki, the full rolled mat. Notice as I bring it up, there are no exposed raw edges now. Everything's folded in and tight so that nothing goes flying after I cut. Then I take it and squeeze it between my knees, holding the top. The best thing to have that we found to secure the mat are rubber bands. They go on very quickly. They'll expand slightly with the mat as it's soaked. And if you have about 6 of them, it's usually very good. We usually like to use them as target areas on the mat, and we can place them where we want to. It's much easier for yourself to use that as a guide when you're creating your cuts. So just take them, double them over, create equal spaces as much as you can on the mat itself, which will give you even cuts as you begin to perform your suemonogiri or tamashigiri test cutting. Once I get most of the one end covered, even everything up, then turn the mat over, keeping good pressure against the folded edge, and finish on the other side. I try to even out all my spacing so that I get nice, even cuts on the mat. That way I get more cuts out of a mat also, that way rather than cutting just one mat in half. And there you have a typically well-rolled mat, fairly even spacing, all ready to soak for 12 hours and perform your cuts. Targeting and cutting are essential to any sword technique. It's as we discussed, it's not only important that you know how to cut and where to cut, but the essentials of cutting and the physics and dynamics of the cutting are not all that difficult once they're understood. And what I'd like to do right now is just go through some of the basic strategies and physics of cutting so that you can understand how to align your body, how to extend the sword, and how to create different cuts at different levels on the wara. This was a soaked tatami. Normally we would soak this in a, obviously this is a dry tatami we're using for demonstration, but if I were to be doing actual cutting, I would be soaking this in a container overnight, maybe 12 hours up to 24 hours, and give it a little bit tougher consistency. That way pieces don't go flying all over the floor. A wet tatami has a tendency to stay together a little better, and it does not scratch the blade, whereas a dry tatami, such as this, as the sword passes through it, although it doesn't cut any more difficult, it will scratch the blade, and it's very messy to clean up afterwards. I'd first like to talk about the swing of the sword itself, so I'm going to step back, and maybe you can check my alignment as I move. I'm going to talk about extension and alignment, not only with the sword, but as the sword and my body is aligned to the target. Normally, we always start off teaching new people how to cut lined feet together directly in line with the target from a jodan position. So we're going to practice all of our cuts from a jodan position. Jodan being above the head. Notice that at this point, my body is in straight alignment with the target. But as I cut, if I cut from here in this position, the sword is still moving forward when it touches the target. In actuality, a sword never really starts to cut until it passes the center line of the body or the furthest extension from the body. So it's important that I align myself so that the initial action of touching the target is in line with the center line is being crossed by the sword. So what I do is as I start my cut, I move my center line to the right. If I'm cutting from right to left with my left foot back, I cut outward and down so that now as I touch the target, the sword is already traveling backward and down toward me, rather than, at this point, it's still moving forward and pushing the target. But in this position, it's pulling toward me as I perform the cut. If I cut from left to right, the opposite is true. I step off and line the target up with my left hip or just off my center line. Extension out, cutting, and now the sword is coming back to me as it starts to cut. Most people have no problem performing a first cut because it's high and the extension, the full extension, is directly out from my shoulders. Notice how much of the sword is left as I perform this cut in alignment to this side of the target. Once I start my cut, full extension, my furthest extension is when my hand is straight out from my shoulder. This is furthest extension. This is where I finally start to make a good extension on the target. In this case, I want to have the monouchi, or the last 9 inches, being the initial cutting part of the target. This is easy to do, but what happens for most people is the further down the target they get, the less sword they have to work with. So it's not only essential that you know where to cut, but you have to align and move closer to the target with each successive cut downward. So as I cut in with the first one, I'm using the monouchi. As I cut in with the second one, I have to move slightly forward to have more sword so that I can use the monouchi again. The same goes for the next cut. I want to maintain cutting surface of the monouchi with each successive cut. And this goes all the way through the target. The other possibility, and sometimes you'll be doing this when you're doing kumitachi or working with another partner, you not only have to, you can lower the sword by moving forward, or you can lower the sword by lowering your body. This also gives you the most extension on the sword as you cut. The other cut we're going to talk about, more difficult cut, is a yokouchi monji or suihei. This is a very flat cut. And we usually practice this from a position, a stance, the feet are spread, the arms are straight out from the target is just off my center line. So that as the sword passes, we're already cutting. Try not to swing the sword from the side. This is actually pushing the sword. And as I turn my body, I want to turn my entire body with the sword, extend and allow it to cut. That way, as my sword then passes the center line of my body, it's slicing. The next cut is a kiriage, or a rising cut. On a kiriage, it's essential that the sword continues to move forward through the cut. So I don't want to just come up and pull the sword back. Let me see if I can pull for you. If I pull the sword back toward me, the cut stops. In kiriage, the kisaki has to move forward to its final position as far away from the swordsman as possible. As soon as the hip retracts, the cut will stop. So if you use these basic principles in cutting, I think you'll find that your cutting will improve, your targeting will improve, and you'll have much better cuts and less chance of bending your sword. Now that you've learned basic targeting, basic physics of cutting, we're going to go on to cover the cutting technique itself on a target or a wrapped wara. Make sure that as you're cutting, you leave enough target area on the mat to complete your next cut. On this cut, we're going to do 2-level cutting. This is your beginning cuts for the beginning level student. These are both kesa cuts. You're going to do a right and left kesa cut. In other words, as we step toward the target, we're going to cut left to right and right to left. Or as you may see Shimabukuro Sensei demonstrate, left to right, then right to left. So please pay attention. Remember to try and keep your cuts as close to a 45-degree angle as possible. That's normally what's used in competition cutting. However, in real combat, the angles will change according to your target areas on a body. But for the mat area, in order to leave more mat for yourself, the 45-degree angle works the best. The 3 new postures introduced in this DVD build on the postures and kamae that you learned in DVD number 1. Assuming migi haso no kamae, as previously discussed, we can lower the sword to the rear and assume migi waki no kamae. Waki is a sideways posture. Notice the kisaki is at the level of the knee. From this posture, when we change feet, we can move into churan no kamae, then into our newest posture, hidari haso. In hidari haso, the tsuba is in line with the corner of the mouth. we can lower the kisaki now into hidari waki. Notice in hidari waki, the left hand is now crossed under the right. Nukitsuke at the middle level or intermediate level of training will introduce what's known as kiriage, or a rising cut. Rising cut is once again done pressuring the center line of the body, turning the blade upward and cutting from the hip through the shoulder to a 45-degree angle above the head. In kiriage, or the rising cut, we approach and push the sword downward so that we can straighten the right hand and the right arm. We then extend the arm forward, pushing, not pulling, threatening the center line of the body. It's the left hand that creates the upward cut. It feeds the sword into the right hand. We turn the left hand, squeeze with the right hand, and cut forward. This action allows the sword to never bind in the saya during the nukitsuke. Keeping the handle on the center line of the body, the sword is drawn directly up the seijusen, or center line. Notice the right hand is extended using only the fingertips. The left hand turns the sword into the right hand. Then the hips expand and turn as the chest expands and cuts upward. The second intermediate drawing cut is known as tsukikage, or moon shadow. The sword is drawn identical to all other nukitsuke till the final sayabinari, or the releasing of the blade. It crosses the opponent's eyes and wrists as the cut is completed. In the tsukikage cut, we actually use two parts of the sword to complete the cut. We're threatening the opponent with both the monouchi and the kisaki. As Shimbu Kuro-sensei draws the sword, notice that his monouchi is going to cross the wrist of his opponent in a jodan posture. The monouchi will first cross the right wrist of his opponent. If the opponent pulls back, then he's using the kisaki, or the tip, to cut the eyes. As an intermediate student of Batodo or Iaido, we'll learn the second set of two-handed cuts. These will be rising cuts. The first is a migi gyaku keisa. In migi gyaku keisa, we assume a low wakigamai. The left hand pulls the sword angular through the body from the bottom of the keisa through the shoulder. Extension and the turning of the body must be properly performed. From a side angle, wakigamai, notice that the arms are crossed. The kisaki is about knee-high. The hips twist, and the sword continues to move forward throughout the entire cut. It never pulls back toward the body. The kisaki continues to move forward through the entire cut. Hidari gyaku keisa is swinging from the right side upward and to the left. With a two-handed cut with the left foot forward, the arms extend through the kisaki, cutting through the keisa on a diagonal cut. Notice the hips twist in the direction of the cut. Thrusting is a critical part of all Bato-ho. Here, Shimbu Kuro-sensei will perform a rear thrust. Draw forward, turn the saya with the left hand, open the hip, and thrust. Notice the tsuka is under the forearm of the right arm. While performing the thrust to the rear, it's critical to make sure that you open the hip far enough that the arm is clear, the left arm is clear of the thrusts. The forward two-hand thrust is referred to as Murotezuki. In Murotezuki, here Shimabukuro Sensei demonstrates a Chudan Murotezuki. It is a straightforward thrust with the hips. Notice that the entire thrust is done with the body, not with the arms. The second Murotezuki is a thrust to the throat. The body inclines forward, thrusting upward through the hips from the feet. The intermediate waza, the katachi we're doing, is tsukikage. Tsukikage is a moon shadow, and what's happening is the opponents are mimicking each other's technique and feeling for the opening. It starts, both uchitachi and shitachi come to Chudan no Kamae. As uchitachi steps forward into haso, it is met by shitachi moving into Geiran no Kamae. This is a complementary kamae. The opening for uchitachi now is a side cut, a yokomen cut, and a kesa toward his temple. As I step in, he's going to receive the technique, not necessarily just with his sword, but his hips are rising and receiving the technique with his body. I step in and cut. He receives, and now this is the area that we need to control. So we both try to control this area by dropping the swords, and then we come into Tsudome. It's trying to stop each other's suba. He's trying to cut my neck, I'm trying to cut his neck, and we're feeling for center. If I go too much to one side, he cuts. If I step out, he can cut. If I push up, he can come under. So we're really feeling for center at this point. So there's a lot going on here. You'll have to practice and play with a little bit with your partner. But the idea is we come to a mutual agreement that neither one has an opening. As we push off, we raise the swords upward and then back. If I lower the sword as I step out, I'm going to get cut. So we have to make sure that we're matching. This is that kage, this shadow, through the entire process. We push off, up, and back to a waki no kamae. This is a good watching position. I'm looking now to see where the opening is. It can be his knee. It could be his body, the do, or it could be the upper shoulder. Whichever one I feel more comfortable with, that's where I'm going to try and take it. If I see that he's committed more one to the other, then that's where I'm going to cut. So it can be any of the three cuts. However, in a very seasoned martial artist, a very seasoned swordsman, you'll notice that his body is very straight. So the most extension I can get is a yoko, a straight cut. So that's what I'm going to go for. As I step in, he receives it by shuffling back and cutting at the exact same time. I cut, just missing, and he's cutting at the same time. I lower my sword. He forces me back with the kisaki, and I slowly raise to Chudan no Kamae. We both lower to Geiran and retreat. Tsukikage. Tsukikage. Tsuigetsuto starts with Uchitachi drawing to Chudan no Kamae. It's matched by Shitachi, And after crossing, Uchitachi pressures forward on the center line and forces Shitachi back into Hasso. Both matching. The pressure for this next cut comes from a little step forward with my front leg, cutting to his side of his head. Coming forward, he matches, back to this position. The Kisaki is now once again online, keeping me from coming in again. So he threatens and pushes me back, making me stop my forward momentum and moving backward as he cuts to my left shoulder this time. Oh, I'm sorry, right shoulder. Then he cuts to my left shoulder. Pushing again with the center line. I match, stop him with my Kisaki this time, and we come back to a center position. Crossing the swords at the Suigetsuto. I thrust to his Sugetsu. He creates an Ukenagashi style block, stepping under and striking. I lower the sword, step back, once again, keeping the center line pressure. I raise the sword and lower the Giran. Suigetsuto. Suigetsuto. Proper grip is imperative to proper cutting technique. If the grip is not correct, then you're going to have a very difficult time getting a straight line on your cut. So what we're going to express and address right now is how to actually approach the handle or the tsuka with your hands as you come at it. The tsuka is slightly curved, just as the sword is slightly curved. There are diamonds that are created by the wrap on the handle itself. We take the left hand and we place it from the back side of the sword toward the handle. The knuckles will be in line with the diamonds. The right hand approaches from the top and is at least 1 finger width from the sword guard itself, the tsuba. So we never want to have the hand tight against the tsuba. We want at least 1 inch to 1.5 inches away. Notice my hands are not wrapped in from the sides, the thumbs are not on top. We're always gripping the sword like we can grip it with 2 hands and support it with the palm of the hand. And gripping. As we come from an overhead, the arms are in line, the wrist bone, the top of the wrist is in line with the wrist bone on the left side. So we don't want to grip from the side, we want to grip from the top. Any good swordsman is familiar with his tools, and his tools in this case happen to be the samurai sword itself, the katana. So what I'd like to go over right now are different parts of the katana that, so that you will recognize those terms and parts of the sword as we go through the rest of the DVD. So if we can take a look at the sword itself, the entire sword is referred to as a katana. Starting with the handle end. The handles are referred to as the tsuka. The tsuka has an end to it, a small butt cap that's called the tsukagashira, or the end cap. The wrapping is called the tsukamaki, or sometimes referred to as ito, which is the actual cord that wraps around it. Inside, you'll notice there is black ray skin in this particular sword. Sometimes it's white ray skin. That's called same. The pegs that hold the handle onto the blade itself are called mekugi. And you're always going to check mekugi before you use it. Make sure that they're tight. Make sure they're not brittle or used or loose. The handguard is referred to as the tsuba. The scabbard is known as the saya. The end of the saya is referred to as a kojiri. There's a small knob on the saya that we refer to as the kurigata. And the kurigata, within the kurigata is attached a string. It's a braided piece of material we refer to as sageo. So the entire sword with the saya, the tsuka, the tsuba is referred to as a katana. If we remove the saya and take a look at the sword itself, you'll notice we have a small collar in this position just forward of the tsuba. The collar is referred to as the habaki. And just behind the tsuba, we have a fuchi. The entire sword of and out by itself, without the tsuba on it, or the habaki, or the tsuka, it's called the toshin. The cutting edge is referred to as the ha. The back edge is referred to as the mine, sometimes referred to as mune. You'll notice there's a raised section through the middle of the sword, running from the base all the way to the tip. That's called the shinogi. It's a raised edge, and many times you're going to be using the shinogi to do your blocking or deflecting with. Behind the shinogi, and on this particular sword, is a small ditch that runs the entire length of the sword, and that is called bohi. The very tip, the curved edge, the entire area is called kisaki, and the curved edge itself is known as the hoshi. Sometimes we use the hoshi to cut, but most of the time we use the cutting edge that goes from a slight line called the yokote that separates the sword from the kisaki back to about 9 inches behind. This area from here to here, from the 9-inch mark up to the yokote, is called the monouchi. There's a cloudy line that runs just along the edge, and that's referred to as the hamon. If you understand these parts of the sword, it's very easy to understand sword technique and how and why this sword works. The basic curvature of the sword, for our express purposes in iaido or bato jitsu, is it has a general curve to it, which we call sori. So there's a general curve that makes an arch. And for iai jitsu or bato jitsu, the perfect curvature, the most curvature is in the very, very center of the sword. So as you continue to learn your sword technique, it's important that you learn a little bit more about the sword. Make sure you have a good cleaning kit so that you can take care of the sword, maintain it, and enjoy your swordsmanship. And a good sword like that will last a lifetime. Targeting is very important when you're performing samurai swordsmanship. It's not enough to be able to perform a cut. It's not enough to be able to perform a waza or a kata, but it's very important that you use the proper placement of the blade on the body in order to perform that cut. Otherwise, it's going to be ineffective or less effective than it could be. So what we'd like to do right now is demonstrate for you different targeting areas of the body that we use for specific cuts. Starting off, the first cut obviously is a downward cut, and we use what we call the men, or the head, is a direct straight cut down the center line of the body. The sword travels outward, and we use the monouchi, the last 9 inches of the blade, to deliver the cut. You don't want to be too shallow, but we want to get enough of the blade in use so that it can cut through. The second cut we're going to use is a yokomen cut. Yoko means side, the men means head, so we're cutting to the side of the head, targeting normally near the temple area. You can go left side or right side as your cut. The next cut on the way down is a kesa cut. The kesa cuts and follows the line of a monk's robe. Or as you see, I'm wearing a monsuki, or a formal robe. We're cutting down along the line of that robe as a kimono as it follows down. So it starts at the neck, kesa cut starts at the neck and follows the line to the opposite hip. Delivering the cut can be delivered with the monouchi or the kisaki. The kisaki can also cut through the body as well as using the monouchi to cut a little deeper. We can cut a kesa from my left shoulder to my right hip, or we can cut a kesa from my right shoulder to my left hip. We can also cut in the opposite direction. We can do a return cut. On a return cut, a rising cut or a kiriage, we cut starting at the hip, and rather than using a kesa, we actually go a little bit further toward the shoulder blade. So we don't really exit the neck area, but the kesa starts here and exits near the point and peak of the shoulder. Cutting diagonally up, right side, then diagonally up the opposite direction, starting at the hip and exiting the shoulder blade. The next cut is a do cut. Do means the main portion of the body. And this can be done from the front or from the back, sometimes cutting behind the shoulder blade or to either side. Yoko, which is a sideways cut, sometimes referred to as suihei. Suihei and yoko are the exact same cut. It's a very flat cut. Or an angular cut as to the body. Right to left, straight through the body, or left to right through the body. Sometimes diagonally through the body from this position. That's still considered a do cut. The other cutting targets are on the extremities. What we refer to as the wrist is known as the kote. So sometimes as I hold a sword, my kote is exposed, particularly my right kote, because it's always forward as I hold the sword. So the kote can be cut in this position. Sometimes the kote is cut in this position. So that is a kote cut. The other cut is a hiza. Hiza is the knee. Sometimes as I perform a hasso no kamae or a jodan no kamae or a waki kamae, obviously the closest target to the opponent is the knee area, and he cuts low to that area. Those are the primary targets in Bato Jutsu or Bato Do. Make sure that as you're performing your waza, as you're performing your kumitachi techniques, your two-man drills, that you are specifically going for those targets to be more effective with your cuts.
僕が、居合を始めたのは三浦先生に会って素晴らしい人だと思ったので、こういう人になりたいと思って始めました。今まで、武道をやって空手少林寺拳法そういうのをやっておりまして、でも三浦先生になった時は本当の武道家侍という感じがして、僕もこのような人になりたいと思って居合を始めました。抜刀法は昔は栄新流のシステムには入ってなかったんですけれども、大日本武道会の要請を受けて福井先生が抜刀法栄新流の技の中から、作られたんです。居合術と抜刀術は、同じようなものですけれども、居合っていうのは人と人がこうパッと面と向かった時ですね。それとか立ってる時も居合、座ってる時も居合、向かい合わせに立ってる時も居合、そういうのを居合、その技が居合術であって、抜刀というのはあくまでも、刀を抜いてその時に切るっていうそういう技なので、居合の方が言葉としては、いついかなる場合にでもその時の対応に変化していけるっていう技ですね。 居合には正座、立て膝、立ち技あるんですが、まあ長らく修行しておられて膝を痛める人もたくさんいてますので、あくまでも武道はやっぱり健康のため、そして、人づくりのためと、なるべくそう健康第一に、そして、技を磨くと同時に心を磨く、それをやっぱり主体にして、我々も、正座立て膝やりますけれども、抜刀はもう年いった方でも膝の悪い方でもどなたでもできるということで、すごく皆さんには練習修行しやすいと思います。
Obviously, having come from America, finding the correct teacher, one that's capable and has the lineage that Shimabukuro Sensei's had, was difficult for most people, and particularly coming from Pennsylvania and having to travel to San Diego and then Japan to Osaka to train with Sensei and Miura Sensei was a bit of a challenge, but it's been well worth it. The martial arts for me, obviously I trained in Karate Do and Aikido in the past, and obviously the next step for that is the pinnacle of martial arts, which is Japanese swordsmanship. The sword obviously became a technical thing at first, but it's become much, much more than that. For me, it's not about what you study, it's about who you study with. It's about learning the true heart of the technique that's been passed down for 450 years, from the very founder through the teachers, the 20 generations, to where Shimabukuro Sensei is now the 21st generation and the designated So-Shihan, or successor to Miura Sensei. And what he's taught me is that the sword is truly an extension of your heart and your intentions. The Japanese believed that the samurai sword was an extension of his soul. It represented his intentions, good and bad. It could be a sword that gave life or a sword that took life. For me, in my daily practice, the sword has become a barometer and a thermometer for telling me what's going on in my life, and even the things that I'm not even aware of yet. For example, as a thermometer, when I draw the sword and cut with it, or if I practice Tameshigiri and the cut's not quite right, it tells me that something's wrong emotionally, and it's automatically reflected in this sword. If it's something that I'm not aware of, it's a barometer. It's a barometer. It tells me that the weather's changing in my life, that something's on over the horizon coming that I may not even be aware of yet. So every day, drawing the sword's a different process. It becomes something I need to do. It tells me about me. It becomes a method of self-actualization for me. And through Shimabukuro Sensei and everything, I think everyone needs a guide. You know, you step off the path, someone to put you back on it, gives you the roadmap and a way to follow. It's about compassion. It's about using the sword for the right reasons and continuing to use it to better yourself and make you a better person for your family.